And it was interesting that throughout all of this period, as one watched it fascinatedly, you know, there was not much you could do, you realize that they were really talking about effectively the image, a place that was largely an empty desert, with a few towel heads prowling around on their camels, right, and an enormous pool of oil underneath, which was by all agreed to be an American sea of oil. I mean, nobody ever said, look, friends, what is our relationship to this oil, which is, you know, 8,000 miles away? Is it ours for the taking, or is it something that we have to deal with in this new world order? And somehow the new world order applied to every place, but not this one. And this was really back in the 19th century, that if you didn't like what some natives were doing, you invaded, you sent the fleet over.
To control the region.
To control the region, basically. Right. And the change in the aims was quite noticeable. At first, it was to prevent an invasion of Saudi Arabia. There was no evidence given that Saddam was going to move on Saudi Arabia. He's never made any claims against Saudi Arabia historically or anything. There have been a whole series of claims against Kuwait. Then it was to protect the American way of life. Then it was the flow of oil. Then it was to punish aggression. Then it was, you know, to assure the new world order. And I think that's where, alas, we are today. Unfortunately, normal people, I mean people, small people, are paying the price of these exalted positions and claims of leaders, rather foolish ones, I think.
The refugees and hostages.
Think of the hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people who've had to be evacuated, whose lives are ruined, and numbers killed, many people killed in Kuwait. Lots of Kuwaitis have lost, I mean, Kuwaitis consider themselves, rightly, I think, to have lost their country. Plus, as you said, the hostages. I mean, all the thousands of foreigners who are stranded, who are used as, I mean, it's a dreadful situation.
The situation in the Middle East and the Gulf crisis is very complex, but the establishment media greatly oversimplify the situation. We'll try to do our little bit to remedy that right now on Alternative Views.
Today we're happy to have Edward Zaid with us on Alternative Views. Edward is professor at Columbia University who will discuss with us today the Mideast crisis and the Palestine question. Edward is the author of many books, including Orientalism and another, The Question of Palestine, and is a member of the Palestine National Council. Also joining us is Professor Barbara Harlow of the English Department at the University of Texas, who has lived in and frequently visited the Mideast and who will join us in the discussion.
I'd like to begin by asking you about the Middle East crisis, which is now being called the Gulf crisis, and how it affects the Palestine question. And I mean that in two ways. One, how it affects the Palestine question on the ground in the occupied territories, but also what kind of impact it's going to have on the solidarity movement with Palestine here in the U.S.
Well, I think it would be right to say that the Palestine question has an effect on the Gulf crisis as well as the other way around. Because I think that the whole question of invasion, of UN resolutions, of sanctions, all of those have a particular resonance for Palestinians in that we feel our country and our society were invaded in 1948. Many of us were driven out. And after '67, the rest of Palestine was taken over by Israel. And although we have a state which was declared in 1988, it is still under occupation despite many, many UN resolutions which have made it absolutely clear, all of them unanimously approved, which have made it absolutely clear that the occupation of Palestine is illegal. But the United States has not been as rigorous and as energetic in pursuing the implementation of these sanctions or of these resolutions as it has in the Gulf. So for many Palestinians, the present Gulf crisis is something that seems like a replay of our own experience, which is one reason why a lot of Palestinians are torn. That is to say, they feel that they cannot approve and do not approve the invasion of one country by another. Although there may be reasons and there are political differences between Iraq and Kuwait, nevertheless the actual act of invasion and occupation is one that makes us deeply uncomfortable. And in my own case, I find extremely repugnant, and I reject it and denounce it, really. But for a lot of Palestinians, there's a sense in which Hussein has come to seem like a symbol of a thwarted Arab nationalism. He has given vent to, in the minds of a lot of people, especially Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, who've been living through 23 years of occupation, he's given vent to a tremendous frustration, which is taken out, of course, on the Kuwaitis themselves and the state of Kuwait, but more importantly than that, on the United States. And he's now in the position, and has assumed the position of a great defender of Arabism and of the Palestine question, positions which have to be taken with a grain of salt, if not a ton of salt. And he claims that he is now fighting the United States, and has tried to make a linkage between the two questions, the Gulf question and the Palestine question. But nevertheless, it is the case, I think, that if one were to be very accurate about it, that Palestinians see in Saddam not so much a champion, I don't think many do, they have no illusions about him, but they see in him somebody who has had the force and the power, because the Iraqi army is so big and powerful, to defy the West and Israel in particular, and to precipitate a crisis, because in the last few months, Palestinians have lived under a tremendous freezing with a new Israeli right-wing government, the breaking off the PLO-USA dialogue, the spectacle or the prospect for us of 1 million Russian Jews coming to Palestine, and the obvious encroachment, the increasing settlement and expropriation of territories. All of that, you see, is part of the background for Saddam's action. So it came as something that Palestinians felt exploded a frozen situation, which was tremendously to their disfavor. Now, I don't think what's happened in the Gulf can be construed as being something that will help Palestinians, really.
Edward, what is the official position of the PLO on the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait? I've seen quite different reports in the media on this.
Well, it's confused, and for that, I think the PLO has to accept criticism. But technically, in terms of publicly announced positions that are official positions on paper, etc., it's roughly as follows. At the Cairo summit on the 9th and 10th of August, the PLO did not vote against the resolution condemning Iraq, sending troops to the Gulf, calling for sanctions, return of territory and so on. It did not vote against that. Incidentally, it's not often noted that that resolution says nothing about international troops or American troops. It only says Arab troops should be sent to the Gulf in support of Saudi Arabia, the defense of Saudi Arabia. The PLO, along with Jordan, Sudan, Mauritania, Libya, which voted against it, but the others, the first three I mentioned, Algeria, voted with reservations. In other words, their vote was recorded as having reservations. They didn't fully endorse it, but they didn't oppose it. Right? Since then, they have gone on the record as being against invasion and against annexation, but have refused to condemn in the same manner as the other Arabs. They haven't joined the Arab Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt, Syria, in threatening Iraq militarily. And the reason given for that is that it's important to preserve a certain amount of in-betweenness so they can play a mediating role, because they've... Now, it should also be said that the PLO has put forward at least 3 negotiating positions which have gotten some attention, certainly in the Arab world and Europe, but none in the United States. Finally, I want to say one more thing, that there have been demonstrations of solidarity by individual Palestinians, even Palestinian leaders, Yasser Arafat himself, going to visit Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. There are pictures put on the media of his embracing him and so on. That has been done, obviously, to discredit the Palestinians, because I think, whereas it might seem as not a very diplomatic or wise thing to do in the current situation, nevertheless, it has been maliciously misinterpreted as saying that the PLO actually supports the invasion of
Right.
Kuwait. That is simply not true.
Over and over, I've seen Kuwaiti officials and others making this claim.
Yes, the Kuwaiti officials, perhaps one ought to excuse them their sorrow and anger at the current situation. After all, they feel they've lost their country.
Right.
But they're saying a lot of wildly unbalanced and, in my opinion, irresponsible things. And a lot of their frustration is being taken out on Palestinians who are obviously weak and
Right.
unprotected. And there's a large Palestinian community in Kuwait, one mustn't forget. It's one of the largest in the world, 300,000. I mean,
And the Kuwaiti government previously had been supportive,
Well,
had they not, of the Palestinians.
well, not only supportive, as a community, it thrived in Kuwait. And it also has to be said that Kuwait owes a lot to Palestinians, I mean, who were important
Contributed a
teachers.
lot,
Yes,
right.
contributed a great deal. The university is staffed with lots of Palestinians, the oil industries. I mean, a very close friend of mine, for example, is a senior oil engineer in the Kuwait Oil Company. And there are lots of Palestinians in jobs of that sort, and they're in the banks, in the airlines, pilots, and so the Palestinian input into Kuwait was considerable. So I mean, there was a mutual integration between them that shouldn't be scanted. Nevertheless, Palestinians were never given, as Palestinians were in Jordan, they were given citizenship. In Kuwait, they were not. So Palestinians always felt
Close
that they
to
were
Kuwait, right.
well close to Kuwait, but second-class citizens, because they
I
were not
see,
given
right.
citizenship. You
Right,
see.
right, okay.
Palestinians were not given the same rights as Kuwaitis were. And this is an unfortunate pattern, and it's happened in many countries, except for Jordan, where Palestinians became Jordanian citizens. They were able to. In Kuwait, it's very difficult for a Palestinian to become a Kuwaiti. So that's always been a source of resentment between the two. But I think the idea that a Palestinian leader seemed to be friendly with Saddam Hussein, therefore be earning the wrath of the Kuwaitis against the simple Palestinian man and woman who has to earn his or her living, is outrageous, partly because also Kuwait, during the Iraqi war with Iran, was paying Saddam. I mean, they supported him, you understand? So I think it's partly the effects of frustration and sorrow and anger.
And the Intifada, in the 3 years, almost 3 years now, that it's been going on, had, at least to my mind, I think really significantly altered the stereotype, the popular stereotype of the Palestinian. It was no longer just terrorist, just refugee holding out the ration card. But there was, from the street, from the homes, an emergent sympathy with the Palestinian question that may not have been shared by the U.S. government and its policies, but still there was this popular reaction that had been growing. What we're beginning to see now as a result of the Gulf crisis is a rather frightening resurgence of anti-Arab images. There are T-shirts around saying "Nuke Saddam" or "Nuke Iraq." What do you think that, talking now about cultural images and cultural stereotypes here in the United States, is going to be the relationship between the improved image of the Palestinians on the one hand and now this sort of chauvinistic xenophobia against the Arabs again as a result of
Well, I don't think it's just a matter of an improved image. I mean, I think there was, in fact, a qualitative change in Palestinian political life on the West Bank and Gaza, as symbolized by the Intifada, and a lot of inaction, a lot of waiting for somebody else to help us, etc., was replaced with a new spirit, rather creative and innovative, that we have to demonstrate for our freedom, and that to create a kind of independent existence for ourselves, even though under military occupation, was the basic goal of the Intifada. And I think that changed the image to a great degree, as of course did the image, not very flattering but also real, of Israeli troops hitherto concealed behind a wall of myths about the purity of arms and the democratic Israel and all the rest of it. Jewish soldiers, Jewish Israeli soldiers beating up children, blowing up houses, killing people, tear gassing, etc. So those scenes had a certain effect, as you said, on life. I think on American perceptions and cultural life in general. And
Making
life.
the U.S. for the first time more critical of Israel, for the first time.
Well, no, there were earlier times, but they never lasted very long.
Right.
There was a certain criticism during the summer of '82.
That's true.
When Sharon, although I must say, and it's worth mentioning because I lived through both of these crises. In '82, when the Israeli army was not only besieging but closing off medical and food supplies from Beirut, a city of close to 1 million people, the United States, in the United Nations, blocked resolutions that were unanimous resolutions against the invasion by Israel. And so it's sort of interesting that the same power now that is so leading the world
Is
in
now
its
mobilizing.
is mobilizing the world because
sanctimonious way,
yes,
right?
exactly, talking about. I mean, it doesn't diminish from the rightness or wrongness of the
Right,
cause. It's just that how strange in those days, Reagan could barely bring himself to say anything about it, and when he did say something about it, or when his representative said something about it in the United Nations, it was always pressing for more. And the phrase, I'll never forget it because I was there at the time, and my entire family, I was in the United Nations or New York, and my entire family was in Beirut being besieged, and I'd see the deliberations in the United Nations. The line was the resolution should be more even-handed, as if there was a Palestinian army besieging an Israeli city, which is complete, obviously, nonsense. But in any event, what happened was the change of image that began in '82 obviously quit. And it started up again in '87 with the Palestinian Intifada that you referred to. I think it's got to be said that among many things that one ought to be critical of Iraq for, and certainly Saddam in this instance, is that his intervention, his aggression against Kuwait, really took the Intifada, as it were, off the front pages.
Took everything off the front
Took
pages.
everything off the front
SNL
pages, including
crisis,
SNL crisis,
economic crisis,
Neil Bush,
all the things that could hurt the Republicans in the election coming up in a few weeks.
But of course, the Palestinians pay a very heavy price for this,
Right.
and there is a grave blow struck rather against Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, because a lot of the money that came from Kuwait, from Palestinians in Kuwait, it no longer comes. So I think there's a temporary respite now. There's a sense in which the Intifada and the Palestinian situation on the West Bank and Gaza is now considered to be sort of marginal. Whereas, as I say, I think it's important to remember that it's really at the root of all of this problem. And B, it's given for, I think only for a very short time, the Israeli right wing a certain sense of, enthusiasm, because they're saying, well, we always told you that the Palestinians and the Iraqis and the Arabs are all crazy, and look at this man, he's invading, as if Israelis had never invaded anything. Of course,
Or the United States, for
or the United States, exactly.
Panama, for
Panama,
instance,
or Grenada,
several months before.
exactly.
Grenada.
All of those are sort of conveniently
Right.
forgotten in this tremendous media storm. But I do think there's a tremendous underground change I've discovered that in a certain sense, or again related to the Gulf crisis, in a certain sense, the discussion of the Middle East is now, and the longer the crisis endures, the more, past the first few days of effectively the media mobilizing the population behind our troops, really. That's what they
behind
did.
the U.S. intervention.
Yeah, exactly,
That
exactly. There was a
focus.
sense in which the media is there to garner public support for President Bush sending of 150,000 troops to Saudi Arabia. But that's good for the first 2-3 weeks, and it's a limited subject.
Right.
After a while, you begin to hear some dissent, and above all, more important even than dissent, are asking questions.
Right.
What are our goals? What are our policies? The other day, for example, the Saudi Arabian government put in a request to buy $22 billion worth of arms. So people want to know, what's that all about? And more people are coming to the understanding that the Middle East is not an empty desert with a lot of oil underneath it and terrorists on top.
It's a complex history.
Complex history, and their societies and peoples and so on and so forth. So I think that will bring back the question of the Intifada.
Eventually. In fact, there has been some focus on Israel recently, so let's turn to this issue. First of all, what has the Israeli position been in terms of this Mideast crisis? What sort of solutions have they been urging? I have the sense that they've been urging military solutions, strikes on Iraq.
I will tell you exactly,
Okay.
because there was an authoritative article published by a man called Benziman in Haaretz, who is the senior political commentator in Israel. It was published around the middle of August of 1990, 2 weeks after the crisis began, in which he put forward the views of the Israeli government. And essentially they are: the regime of Saddam Hussein has to be destroyed. Its military capacity has to be destroyed. Its industrial capacity has to be destroyed. And in effect, the kind of bombing that only a massive airstrike could accomplish would have the effect of setting back Iraq for roughly 2 generations. And this was exactly echoed a few days ago in the Washington Post by General Duggan, the Air Force Chief of Staff, you recall, who was fired by Cheney a couple of days later. But the Israeli view has, I think, had a kind of hegemony, has prevailed in planning in Washington, I believe, to a fantastic degree, that the only way to deal with this particular crisis, which is a real crisis, is essentially military. And I have a very great fear that the military solution is, in fact, the only solution acceptable, both to the Israelis and to the United States at this point, unless some air is, some sun is let in and it opens up. And the Israeli position is, very simply, that any sign of Arab strength, any sign of Arab determination, of capacity for mobilizing, for, in fact, providing a real deterrence to Israeli superiority, which is assured principally by the United States, has to be hit. And it's the similar mentality that you find in Israel and Washington with regard to the Arab world and with regard to the Middle East is, I think, the single most important source of instability and war in our region.
That it's really creating a war psychosis or hysteria.
And there's no alternative to it. You see, nothing else is rationally permissible.
No negotiations.
No. The only way to deal with it, and this has really been true from the very beginning of the founding of Israel in 1948. There have been some Israeli histories written of that early period, the first 1 or 2 years, 48 and 49, when numerous Arab states, including Syria and Egypt and Jordan, tried to sue Israel for peace, to make an immediate peace agreement with them, and Ben Gurion at the time said, no, it is better for us to be in a state of war with them, because that way we can get the support of the West, we can keep ourselves on a war footing, and above all, for this particular line, or this particular view in Israel, it keeps us separate from the Arab world, you see. And it really appears that one of the important programs, therefore, of a large majority of the Israeli elite, and certainly this is true of the Likud, is that the only Arab is a dead Arab, the only good Arab is a dead Arab, and the best Arab is one that's far away and angry at you. And the idea that Israel should be in some kind of creative or normal relationships with its surrounding, they're simply not equipped to deal with it. And I'm afraid the United States has the same view.
In fact, I think there's another problem here, that Israel envisages a double shot at Iraq. In other words, the U.S. and Israel would act together in this military action, that Israel would actually participate.
Well, I think Israel has been
and this would link the U.S. and Israel.
Well, I think there's worse than that, because the Israeli famed or legendary strategic alliance with the United States has proven to the eyes of nearly everyone to be absolutely a myth. I mean, Israel in this particular crisis is useless. I mean, there's nothing the United States can do. Anything that Israel might do would make matters worse rather than better. That's number one. Number two, the Israelis have had to be restrained by the United States from demonstrating too vociferously their aims and so on and so forth. Three, nevertheless, the Israeli leadership inside Israel has made no secret of the fact that its two principal aims beyond the destruction of Iraq are, number one, and this has been publicly stated by cabinet ministers, Naaman, Geula Cohen, others. Number one, in the event of an Iraqi Israeli war, the largest number of Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza would be driven out. It would be called a forced transfer. And this is something that this is really one of the great constants in
that would
Israeli
give them
policy.
an excuse to almost exterminate or to eliminate
them or get rid of them. I mean,
the final solution.
Final solution, exactly. That's a very good word for it. And the second goal is to invade, otherwise tamper with the present sovereignty of Jordan, you see, because there is in fact a close relationship between Iraq and Jordan. I mean, they're neighbors. Right. The Jordanian economy depends to a very great deal on Iraq. Iraq depends a great deal on one of its two outlets to the sea, Aqaba.
And there's strong support in Jordan for Hussein.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, because of the links between the two countries. I mean,
and Arab nationalism.
Right. So one of the things that has been very much in the minds of people like Sharon is to destroy the Hashemite king and the throne, and perhaps institute a Palestinian regime of some sort, which is what they tried to do in Lebanon, by the way, in 1982. The idea was to get rid of the present government and put in a government loyal to Israel. So there's something of that sort in the air now. It's immensely dangerous and mischievous. And of course, like all of this, their schemes cannot work. But it will cause a lot of damage and kill a lot of people.
Some reports coming back from Jordan and the occupied territories suggest that some of the minefields along the border between Israel and the occupied territories and Jordan are being dismantled. And what could this imply? The population transfer you're referring to, or some more egregious aggression against Jordan?
No, they've made it absolutely clear that in the event, for example, that the Iraqis send a battalion into Jordan, Israel will invade.
So it'll be just total chaos if there's military action against Iraq. Exactly. Israel will go on the offensive. And
Israel's theory, and you can see, I think if I put this as starkly as I think it needs to be put, you could see how badly this bodes, I mean, for the Middle East, and how destructive a policy it is. That Israel's theory is that the more mayhem, the more disorder and chaos and destruction and poverty and volatility in the Arab world, the better for it. Okay. That's only one part of it. The other part of it is Israel is also assured that no matter what it does, this is very important, who will pay for it? The United States.
The U.S., and it links them together closely, which actually raises the other question, another question, and that is, given the virtual alliance of the United States with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, is Israel as much of a strategic ally, an important ally for the United States as it once was? Previously, Israel was going to be the bedrock of American influence and power in the Mideast, but now it seems that oil is of more real strategic interest to the U.S. than any sort of ideological ties to Israel, and the connections with Egypt and Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries are strengthening with the U.S.
Yes.
So what perspective does this put on the U.S.?
Well, I think what you said earlier, the notion of Israel being a strategic ally, it's not clear it's a strategic ally for the United States as what, doing what. It's not doing anything. It may be its greatest contribution from the point of view of the current United States policy in the Gulf is to do nothing, which is a rather dubious reward for, what is it, $55 billion that Israel has gotten from us in aid in the last 3 decades. Second, the policy of the United States of pursuing its interests in the Middle East militarily, which is what it's doing now, in alliance with relatively unpopular and fairly fragile regimes. I mean, I think that's certainly true of Saudi Arabia. It's less true of Egypt, but it's not a distinctively popular regime, a government of Hosni Mubarak, will have the effect, ironically, of destabilizing them. You see, I mean, it
creates anti-American sentiment that's linked with their government.
Exactly, and delegitimizes their own governments. I mean, what government, for example? I mean, you don't have to be a political scientist, just a man or woman in the street saying, well, here we are spending, $50, $60 billion on arms. We just bought $20 billion. Speaking now of the Saudi. $20 billion of U.S. arms. But we still can't defend ourselves. We need an army of 150,000 here to defend us, A. And B, who's paying for this army? I mean, we have to remember that the United States has put itself in the position of being, in effect, a kind of mercenary army, because the United States is requiring the Emir of Kuwait and the royal family of Saudi Arabia to pay for the troops there.
And to get Japan and West Germany to kick in.
But it further discredits, this. It's a rather strange alliance. And third, I mean, there's another problem, is that, what happens if this army doesn't leave? Right? I mean, supposing it sits around for a couple of years. I mean, at times the Secretary of State has said we're going to be there for a long time. And even President Bush has said we're going to be there a long time. We're talking years now.
Decades.
Decades.
Korea, some people are making this metaphor.
I mean, the prospects are not, I mean, the more time goes on, the less good, I think, are the prospects. So.
Well, Saddam Hussein at one point gave some proposals for negotiations that would involve dealing with the Palestinian question, dealing with the Kuwait question dealing with U.S. troops in the region. And of course, the U.S. totally dismissed these negotiating issues.
Yes.
And I've heard rumors that Arafat and others have been talking to Hussein, who does seem willing to negotiate. Do you think these are serious proposals
I think
that the Iraqis are putting forth, and the U.S., by not taking them seriously, is resisting a negotiated solution to this?
I think that it's a complex issue, and I think some things have to be made clear. I myself believe that what Saddam did in occupying Kuwait, invading it, annexing it, etc., was wrong. I mean, I have no sympathy with it, whatever, as a position. Nevertheless, there was a series of provocations by Kuwait, perhaps at the instigation of the United States, perhaps not, that could constitute, in fact, an act of war, could be seen as constituting an act of war against Kuwait, against Iraq. The increase in the level of production, which of course affected the Iraqi economy. The whole question of borders has never really been satisfactorily settled. The question of the oil fields, this Rumaila oil field, the two islands, access to the sea. There are a lot of, Iraq is an important country in the region. It is a regional power. We've allowed ourselves as Americans, to run the whole hemisphere, and in fact, as many hemispheres as we possibly can. Iraq is a regional power. It has interests, and those have not been attended to. I think, therefore, there was a basis for unhappiness, if not for, I certainly don't think there was a basis for invasion. It could have been settled. I think now it would be prudent, because the alternatives, that is, say, war, would be catastrophic for everyone, including America. It would be prudent to explore, perhaps not immediately because the positions are so hardened on both sides, to explore the possibilities of a negotiated settlement, which would involve the troop withdrawal and so on and so forth. My only problem, my main problem rather, with the American position on this is that we have committed so many troops to the area. We've taken such harsh positions. The President has made such extraordinarily tough statements that it would be very difficult. I mean, if you talk about saving face and all the rest of it, it would be very difficult at the present juncture for him to say, okay, let's negotiate. The same applies to Iraq. Unfortunately, normal people, small people, are paying the price of these exalted positions and claims of leaders, rather foolish ones, I think.
The refugees and hostages.
Think of the hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people who've had to be evacuated, whose lives are ruined, and numbers killed, many people killed in Kuwait. Lots of Kuwaitis have lost, Kuwaitis consider themselves, rightly, I think, to have lost their country. Plus, as you said, the hostages. All the thousands of foreigners who are stranded, who are used as, it's a dreadful situation. And there's no question that the provocations were there, in the air all along, crystallized in the Iraqi invasion and then the American response, and you have the makings of a full-scale catastrophe.
It's been actually quite striking, you talking about the refugees, the ways in which these people have been represented in the media. And we have two sets of people, refugees and hostages. If you're Western, you're hostage. If you're Asian, you're a refugee. And the kinds of narratives that have been constructed around these people have been respectively different.
Right.
So their fates will be decided differently as well. And I think this gets into the whole question of the media and the role that the media has played in aiding and abetting, if you will, the U.S. military effort there. And you've written so much about this in other contexts. And
it's worth recalling, actually, a moment that crystallized or symbolized what you're talking about. It was a late-night show about, it must have been around the end of August. It was obviously an answer to Ted Koppel's, Nightline. They brought out Charles Kuralt
on CBS.
Right. With Leslie Stahl.
Right.
And for reasons that have to do, obviously, with having to invent a program every night. One of the nights, they focused on the refugees, those poor people in the Jordanian desert who are stranded there by the hundreds of thousands. At the very end of the program, after a recital, a narrative of the most appalling misery and suffering.
Which is a nightly spectacle, really.
It hadn't become one yet, but that was like the first exposure.
Right.
It has been.
Right.
But at that time, it was sort of early in the thing, although they'd been there for some time, and obviously the refugees are a staple of this kind of event. at the very end of the program, having seen the news reports and talked about them with various witnesses on the spot, Charles Kuralt had to conclude the program. And he said, well, good night, Leslie. I must say, he said, that in our interest, in our focusing on the Western hostages, we seem to have lost sight of, and then there was a pause because he didn't quite know what to say. Then he just said, those people. I mean, as if there was another category of humanity which had just suddenly appeared to him, because the real focus of attention was, of course, the fate of the Western and especially the American hostages.
Right.
And that was the whole story right there.
In fact, once the refugees became a story, and Dan Rather was over there trying to look like Nick Nolte as, you know, First World Reporter in Revolution Torn Third World Country, is, you know, looking tanner and tanner.
Rather of Arabian. Right,
yeah. And he was there in the Jordanian desert and was focusing a little bit on this. The danger seemed to be that perhaps these refugees were going to become an issue, which we really wouldn't want to have happen.
Right.
And he showed one of them getting on the bus to leave with his family, and the concluding remarks of that show were, this man, unlike the unfortunate Western hostages, has been able to leave together with his family. He is lucky.
Lucky him, right.
He only lost everything in his Kuwait or Iraqi
and his country,
domicile, and has nothing to return to.
I know. No, but I think the role of the media in this crisis has been rather interesting, because you could actually see it at the outset. Not very much is known about Kuwait, and I think not very much is known about Kuwait until now. In other words, I think very little of the city, of the country, of the whole society that was displaced and destroyed by Iraq has ever made it into. But I think it's true to say that the first task of the media was not so much to inform. I mean, obviously there was a certain level of news that had to be given, you know, the troops coming in, the numbers of tanks and all the rest of it, the American response, etc. But basically, and it was almost admitted, I think on several occasions explicitly, that the job of the media was to gather support for the president.
Right.
I mean, there was no question that that was the number one priority. Second, to explore the options for the president, given the presence of American troops on the ground. I mean, and here, you know, some of the more liberal programs, the ones with more airtime that discuss McNeil-Lehrer, for example, Nightline, etc. There, the focus was almost entirely on geopolitical and military strategists, you know. And that's when you had Kissinger come out, and you had, well, that interesting difference between him and Brzezinski appeared. But basically, it was the ex-secretaries of state, the ex-secretaries of defense. Harold Brown appeared many times. Schlesinger appeared many times.
In which Kissinger and others were actually arguing for military action, taking the Israeli
arguing. I think arguing is too mild a word for it. They were urging. They were urging. They were egging on, saying, you know, we have to do this, and of course always the euphemisms. They would never say bomb them into the Stone Age. Right. Reduce or take away their military assets by surgical strikes, whatever that means. I mean,
and the whole Hussein.
Well, that didn't really come up as much, but there was that implied.
Right.
And it was interesting that throughout all of this period, as one watched it fascinatedly, you know, there was not much you could do. You realize that they were really talking about effectively the image, a place that was largely an empty desert, with a few towel heads prowling around on their camels, right, and an enormous pool of oil underneath, which was by all agreed to be an American sea of oil. I mean, nobody ever said, look, friends, what is our relationship to this oil, which is, you know, 8,000 miles away? Is it ours for the taking, or is it something that we have to deal with in this New World Order? And somehow the New World Order applied to every place, but not this one. And this was really back in the 19th century, that if you didn't like what some natives were doing, you invaded. You sent the fleet over
to control the region.
To control the region, basically. Right. And the change in the aims was quite noticeable. At first, it was to prevent an invasion of Saudi Arabia. There was no evidence given that Saddam was going to move on Saudi Arabia. He's never made any claims against Saudi Arabia historically or anything. There have been a whole series of claims against Kuwait. Then it was to protect the American way of life. Then it was the flow of oil. Then it was to punish aggression. Then it was, you know, to assure the New World Order. And I think that's where, alas, we are today.
In fact, the most disturbing thing that I have seen on this is the CNN story. Every night, Crisis on the Gulf.
Yes.
They have a 1-hour program for the first hour of their primetime news. It supplants everything else on the news. All you see is Crisis on the Gulf, and it's jingoistic as can be. They play martial military music. They have all these statistics in between the news segments about the amount of foreigners who are held hostage in Kuwait or Iraq. They have all of the statistics on the multinational troops that are supposedly with the U.S. in the desert or maintaining the blockade. It's almost all this geopolitical strategic analysis that you talked about, where Pat Buchanan will get some thugs from the Pentagon and right-wing think tanks, and we'll talk about the options.
Although it should be noted that some people like Buchanan have been opposed to military action in the Gulf. I mean, there's been
Rosenthal in the New York Times
attacked him as being an anti-Semite for saying those things. But it's interesting that there has been a split in conservative ranks on the question of military versus diplomatic action. But all of what you're saying is, I think, underpinned by a sense that there is nothing in the Middle East of any interest, you see, except the oil. That basically the less said about the cultures, the societies and so on there, the better. That there is a history, that there's a people, that there's a culture, that there's a religion, that there's a tradition. All of those things are unimportant. And I think it's backed by a quite remarkable series of attacks against the region, written globally by well-known sort of Orientalists, experts on the Middle East, who write about the Muslim rage and the Arab this, that, and the other thing, and the madness of the soul. I mean, suggesting that you're really dealing here with a kind of a loony bin.
Oh, with barbarians.
Well, but more complex, because there's a lot of parade of learning here and there, and everybody tries to trace everything back to the Quran, and they're saying that this is all in the Quran.
Religious fanatics, then.
Well, I think yes, exactly. It's religious. It's a sort of ethno hostility of a fantastically powerful kind. And then so the question of whether a surgical strike is a possibility, becomes a kind of a theoretical question, like you discuss in a seminar, whether universals exist or not. It has that kind of quality, and not something that has to do with the destruction of real people in real time.
And their cultures, and their histories, and their homelands.
Now, what is the reason? I mean, one of the questions that is of great interest to me is what is the reason for this rather diminished, and not to say impoverished, view of the Arab world? Why is it? I don't have an answer to it, but why is there this kind of iron curtain of ignorance against a culture and let's say a literature? I mean, there's a lot of interest, as you know, in third world literature. People read, great writers of Latin America, Africa. Wally Soyinka won the Nobel Prize. Chinua Achebe is considered a great writer. Garcia Marquez.
There's translations of all of this literature. It's discussed in the top magazines.
Exactly. Arabic literature, which is a considerable literature, let's say, it's the literature of 200 million people, is in fact being translated. But the question is, why is no notice taken of it? That the works of these fine writers and essayists and poets and novelists and filmmakers and dancers and singers and so on, none of it is taken care of. None of it is looked at with any kind of interest. It's a question that bothers me, because it would seem to me that would exactly modify this rather antiseptic and quite bloodless and even bloodthirsty view of the Arab world as a place you could bomb.
Some of the works that you've been talking about recently, for example, in the most recent article in The Nation, refers specifically to a text that deals with oil and culture in the Middle East. In fact, there's sort of perhaps two lessons here: that politicians might need a little culture, and that Arabic culture has a lot to offer, rethinking our concepts of literature here in the West.
Well, it's a remarkable novel. It's a trilogy of which only one volume has appeared so far in English. Cities of Salt, it's called, by Abdurrahman Munif, which it's a great work of literature, I have no doubt. And it's the only work, I think, that in any language, it's certainly the only work in Arabic, that deals from the point of view of somebody who is himself a Saudi Arabian, right, with the discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia in the 30s, and the coming to Saudi Arabia of the Americans, and the dislocations that take place in Saudi Arabian society, the oasis. I mean, the novel first begins in an oasis.
So it's a historical epic that gives you an overview of
but it's more than just an epic. It's a very fine analysis of a kind of life that people like myself, I mean, people assume that all Arabs are really basically Bedouins. That's simply not true. I mean, I come from the zone, the part of the world that is, fertile and urban. I know nothing, literally, about what life is like in the Arabian desert. And most Arabs, say, in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt, know very little about it. This is why it's such an... Anyway, here's this work which makes an analysis of this, and it's not so much an analysis as a presentation of this, and it's simply never reviewed. I mean, we're not talking about a kind of a third-rate Leon Uris novel. We're talking about a really first-class work of literature that would normally, but it's as if that if you were to talk about it in some way, you would legitimate it. And the great danger is to legitimate anything Arab, because in the minds, again, this is part of the tremendous amount of disinformation, and you might say it's the fallout from the war of the Arabs, or let's say the Palestinians and Israel, that anything that suggests that the antagonists of Israel have any merit at all would in some way be detracting from Israel. Therefore, the position is that you must never say anything good about the Arabs, because the Arabs are principally enemies of Israel, therefore nothing good about them can be said. With the result that the literature is simply ignored, and that what can be learned from it, let's say, even on the level of a human experience, becomes totally impossible. The principal symbol of this for me was about 8 or 9 years ago. And a well-known New York publisher who is, and I mentioned this in the article I wrote in The Nation.
In The Nation, you published an article
about this, in which this New York publisher, who was very interested in European and non-European literature, in other words, he was American, he was a commercial publisher, very adventurous, said to me, I want to publish a series of novels. I want to establish a series in my publishing house of unconventional or non-European and third world novels. Could you give me a list of some that you know about that I could publish? So at the top of the list I gave him were 2 or 3 novels by Naguib Mahfouz, who a few years later was to win the Nobel Prize, the Egyptian novelist, who won it in '88. And some other novels, not in Arabic. And a few months later I ran into him, and he had started the series, and I noticed the announcement contained none of the Arabic works that I had recommended to him. So I said to him, what happened? I mean, he said, look, I have a great problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, get this, I mean, listen to this phrase. Arabic, he said, is a controversial language. As if to say that if you were to approach Arabic or to treat it like a language, like any other language, that would in some way be disturbing people. And there are instances one hears of people speaking, for example, in times like this, go back to Barbara's question earlier, where there's a crisis in the Middle East, people speaking Arabic on a plane, for example, in Chicago, flying between Chicago and Detroit, are asked by the passengers next to them on the plane not to speak Arabic because it disturbs the other passengers, and sometimes taken off the plane. I mean, there's this kind of, and a certain kind of anti-Arab hysteria, which is enforced obviously by the movies. If you look at the movies, it's very hard to think of a film or a television program in which Arabs are not depicted either as complete fools or as bloody-minded, fanatics and murderers and terrorists, or as sort of sleazy oil sheiks who have got lots of money and sort of paunchy and running after young men and women. So there's a kind of legitimized, sanctioned racism about a whole culture, which I think has fed into the current situation and made it, the kind of extraordinary standoff that it has become.
In fact, this was the point that I was going to make, that the other side of the story in terms of American perceptions of Arabs are the stereotypes on film and television.
Absolutely.
When Michael Ryan and I were doing the research for Camera Politica, our book on Hollywood film, we saw something like 60 films that dealt with Arabs over a 3 or 4 year period, and every single one of them were precisely the stereotypes that you mentioned. Even this one Jane Fonda, Alan Pakula film, Rollover, about the banking world. There was sort of anti-capitalist
I didn't see that, no.
Jane Fonda liberalism on one level, but again, it had the worst stereotypes of the Arabs imaginable.
Yes, and there is simply no exception to it. Not at all.
Images.
No countervailing at all.
And no films, as you mentioned, either by Egyptian or any Arabic filmmakers. Some Iranian films.
Some Iranian, but of course they're not Arab. But right. I mean, there are a few attempts here and there to start, for example, an Arabic film festival. There were some films shown in Seattle in the summer of this year, but by and large, no. I think there's this. It's like there's a veto.
Right.
Veto. You can't do this. Now, one has to say, to a certain degree, the Arabs themselves are to blame for this. I mean, there are 20 Arab countries. One thinks, what if the money that is now being spent to finance American troops, money spent by Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to pay for the American troops there, what if that had been spent on translating a whole library of Arabic
or
literature,
giving
making
research
films. Exactly.
grants
I
or
must
universities.
say, it really causes one to think. So that, and I've talked to many Arab writers, and I've said to them, listen, it's no good what you do to write your books, make a contract of one book with some Western publisher like Penguin or something, and that's the end of it. You should have a union, and you should make contracts with houses and translate whole, and provide that the books are going to be distributed and reviewed and cared for, not just sort of flung out into the marketplace. Because a lot of books are there, there's simply nobody pays any attention to them.
It's also a function, though, isn't it, of universities? We're talking about multiculturalism now, and having more women's studies, third world studies.
I think the result of the last 40 or 50 years in our life as Arabs in the Middle East has been so skewed and has become so, there's something so distorted about our life there that culture has paid a very heavy price for this, that there's so much focus on the conflict with Israel, the problems of economic development in a world which is so polarized, first during the Cold War and now in the nationalisms between Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Syria and Jordan, the Palestinian, all of those things, so that culture is put down to the very bottom. But I still feel that a lot of the blame has to be laid again not only on us as Arabs, but on us, those of us who are Americans, who in this country pay no attention to this and simply, as I say, treat it as a geopolitical, essentially.
Part of the tragedy, this just occurred to me, is oil. The fact that all of this oil is in the Mideast, and that's what the Arabs are equated with, and that's where the greed stereotype emerged in the 1973, 1974 OPEC embargoes and the gas lines. And
that's one of the important motifs of that book, that novel by Abdurrahman Munif, The Cities of Salt, which is the first. In fact, it's the only
This brought imperialism to this country. There was no these countries.
Well, not only
there
that,
was no interest in this region.
It destroyed the rhythms of the indigenous life. Which was, for example, in the case of the first part of the novel, where the novel is set in an oasis. The oasis is destroyed. I mean, once you have oil, you don't really care about water and a place for caravan routes. That people stop and rate, and the seasons no longer matter because everything's air conditioned. You understand? And life is displaced from the oasis to the port city. You see, that's so all of those things, and it's very difficult in a highly charged and extremely important, strategically important part of the world, therefore, to be able, under the pressure of this tremendous wealth, which is of worldwide importance, to lead a normal life. There's so many pressures on you, there's so many wars and instabilities there, so that one feels the sense of a kind of endless deferral of the important things. So, there's been so much attention paid in the media to fundamentalism, to Muslim fundamentalism. And because of for obvious reasons. It simply reinforces the negative stereotype and so on and so forth. People forget that there are other types of fundamentalism. There's Christian fundamentalism, which is just as unattractive, or Jewish fundamentalism and so on. That's one problem. But the other problem is, in the focusing on the Muslim fundamentalism as supporting the essential stereotype of the mad Arab or the terrorist Arab, right? What's happened is that what is forgotten is that there's a long and quite interesting, perhaps relatively to the Western eye, invisible struggle going on in many of these societies between modernity, or modernism, if you like, on the one hand, and secularism, you see, and Islam on the other. And I think it's wrong to assume just because there's so much prominence given to these Muslim movements, which are different in different countries, of course, and have different aims and trajectories, that very little attention is paid to the struggle of many people who are trying to investigate the problems of modernity, the problems of what is our relationship to the past, what is our relationship to the West, what is our relationship to oil. Those are important issues that, were they taking place, for example, in Czechoslovakia, you'd have endless writers' congresses led by, Kurt Vonnegut and Susan Sontag going there to discuss with them, whereas none of it is ever paid any attention to, you see, in the Arab world. With the result that the fundamentalists get all the attention. There's a tremendous issue focusing, of course, around women's rights, for example, or the rights of minorities, which are important because the Palestinians play an important role in this. The question of the relationships between different religions. The Middle East is a mosaic of all of that is sort of ignored. All that matters seems to be oil and getting it for ourselves.
To conclude our discussion, because we're running out of time, what should the position of progressives be on this whole Iraqi question, and what kind, if any, of either short-term or long-term solutions to this set of problems do you envisage?
I think this is perhaps going to force the hand of the progressive movement in the United States which has more or less systematically neglected the Middle East and certainly the Palestine question over the last decades, and is now coming up pretty shorthanded in terms of dealing with this massive military mobilization in the U.S., so that it may well be a moment, if one can speak as opportunistically as this, to put the Middle East and the question of Palestine finally on the progressive agenda in the United States, where it has not had enough of a role, where it has not been allowed enough of a role in the last decades.
I would agree with that and add to it simply this, that progressives in this country have historically opposed military intervention, whether it was in Vietnam or other parts of the Third World, Libya, Grenada, etc. I think it would be wrong for progressives now to oppose U.S. military intervention only. I think it would be very important to say that U.S. troops out, but let us look again at what brought them there in the first place, you know, and because there hasn't been a military intervention on this scale in this short a time since World War II. So what are the issues? I mean, I think progressives and others, I mean, I think concerned citizens have a right to, especially people who have family members in the armed forces, to ask the question, what is it that draws us and ties us to the Middle East? And how does that connect with some of the things that are being said by the Arabs, most of whom are not supporters of Saddam, but who say, you know, after all, it's I think the important thing, therefore, is the realization on the part not only of progressives but Americans that we play a very important role in having formed this problem. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not something that happened to us and we're innocent bystanders, right, and now we're trying to get in and put out the fire. We are part of the current history of the Middle East for the last 40 or 50 years, since World War II, with the end of the British and the French hegemony over the colonial hegemony. The United States has been the single most important outside factor in Middle Eastern life. It's made possible not only Israel, but what has gone on in many other countries, including the oil, etc. And therefore, it's about time that we pay attention to what we're doing. And my demands are much more modest than Barbara's. All I'm saying is find out what has been done in your name as an American, or our name as Americans.
That's the end of this Alternative Views. Frequently hear from viewers who request a list of news publications which we use on Alternative Views, and also a reading list for U.S. power structure in the mass media. If you would like to have these, send a stamped, self-addressed envelope to the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. You must send a self-addressed stamped envelope. We also can provide information on how you can get publications by John Stockwell. We would like to thank our crew for making this program possible. Eric Eubank was our cameraman, and Kevin L. West was the audio person. Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. We'll leave this up a little while longer so you can jot it down and write to us. Goodbye.